we're going to go from a small number of applications and a small number of websites to potentially one or two LLMs, which are our funnel to the rest of the internet and how we interact with them. A lot of the major AI companies, if you look at some of the things they're producing, you can already tell the internet's moving in this direction. What that tells us is that we're kind of on a clock. Like, we're running out of time to make sure that if AI becomes the dominant form or like the form factor of the internet, that it doesn't also make the internet more closed. And the way to do that is by fixing the incentive structures. And the way to do that is with crypto.
This episode is sponsored by Sei, the parallel execution EVM compatible layer 1 with sub-second finality. Incentives for users are coming to Sei this month from teams like DragonSwap. Start farming on Sei today by visiting dragonswap.app. We'll hear more from Sei later in the show. If you like the Lightspeed podcast, then you need to subscribe to the Lightspeed newsletter, written by a team including yours truly and delivered to your email inbox daily. Lightspeed is your essential daily briefing on all things Solana. Exclusive news, deep analysis, and the latest trends delivered in a way that's digestible and, I think, sometimes kind of funny. Stay ahead of the curve with the same insights that guide readers from Brevin Howard, Gemini, Jito, CME Group, Solana Labs, and Foundation, and many more. The link to sign up can be found in today's show notes or if you go to blockworks.co. Subscribe to the Lightspeed newsletter today. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Lightspeed. I'm your host, Jack Kubinek, joined today by Andrej Radonjic. How'd I do, Andrej?
You did well, yeah.
Great.
Said it perfectly.
Yes. Andrej is the CEO of Wind Labs, which is the developer of the Grass network. And Grass just carried out one of the largest airdrops ever, maybe as far as the number of wallets affected, like literally hours ago, to the point where we're recording this. So I guess we'll start there, Andrej. How are we feeling a few hours post TGE?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's always a pleasure chatting with you, Jack. And as far as how we're feeling, I'd say sentiment's pretty fine. I mean, it is the most widely distributed airdrop of all time. Almost 3 million individual users, segregated by residential IP address and device fingerprint and all of that, are trying to go and claim their airdrops right now on Solana. And for us, the most exciting thing is the fact that users who have been contributing to the network for the past year are now being rewarded with network ownership. So this is where we can actually really begin the journey and start building, what we're trying to build, which is an internet scale web crawl.
Mm-hmm. So immediately post airdrop, I was following this. We covered it in the Lightspeed newsletter today. Wallets start breaking. And as you mentioned, it's a very widely distributed airdrop. I'm guessing tons and tons of different wallet addresses were trying to connect and claim their airdrop allocation. So what was that like in the Grass, situation room, seeing as Phantom had downtime and Backpack experienced difficulties?
Well, to be honest with you, it was expected. We did an entire campaign around breaking the chain back in March. In the lead up to our announcement of the data roll-up that Grass is building. And I think, today is evidence of why that data roll-up is necessary. If, almost 3 million wallets just trying to claim an airdrop starts breaking things on Solana, imagine what happens when there are 10 times more nodes on the network and proofs of every web transaction being pushed to the network starts getting pushed to Solana. Yeah, I mean, we kind of expected it. I want to give a huge shout out actually to the team at Helios. They've been doing an amazing job with their RPCs.
Yeah, that's what was interesting. Is you would think that with RPCs being the kind of protocol by which programs interact with each other, that would have been what was at fault, and that's what caused Phantom to go down and Backpack to struggle. But I talked to Helios, I talked to Triton One. Neither of them said that there were issues on their end, or if there were, they were resolved quickly. So I'm sure we'll get some kind of post-mortem from Phantom, but I'm curious to actually find out what is causing the problems that folks were having with the back end of Phantom.
Yeah, I suppose we'll see whenever they come out with that. But yeah, as I said, phenomenal job done by the Helios team. Those guys really know what they're doing.
Are you like relieved? I feel like from founders I speak to, it is just your life becomes hell for the the number of months that you've announced that an airdrop is coming, with people, asking about allocation. Like, just are you happy to be done with it at all?
I mean, nothing's done, right? Today's the first day of grass. And I wouldn't say relief is the feeling, more so excitement for the future and what's to come. What we've been there's this interesting paradigm that we see actually in crypto, and to a large extent, crypto's kind of lost its way. Where traditionally, like, the whole point of decentralizing technologies is to shift power back to where it belongs by using crypto economic incentive mechanisms. And we've seen this interesting trend recently where so many projects kind of build a ton of hype and then finally distribute network ownership, and then that's the last day of the project effectively. And I can't really blame people for thinking that way, because that's what they're used to. Like, that's been the case in crypto for years now. But what's so exciting about grass is the fact that this is literally the first day of the network. Like, today enables all the future use cases that grass is building and that others are building on top of grass.
So, I mean, how do you kind of future-proof grass? Like, I would imagine the grass airdrop required no financial stake. So there were a lot of people who are participating just because there was essentially zero downside risk for them. And you'd think some of them stop participating in the network, maybe uninstall the Chrome extension. So how are you thinking about, hey, like, we don't want to be an airdrop and then kind of fade away over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to your point, a lot of protocols that require some form of financial participation, they'll do an airdrop. Then after that, for a lot of people, it's kind of this trade where, okay, how much money do I put at risk to participate in an airdrop or whatever? And then they go and do that. The thing about grass, and like actually what makes it unique, is the fact that the network is replacing an incentive structure that's fundamentally broken, where people are already renting out their resources to centralized companies, but aren't being compensated for it in any way, shape, or form. And it's incredibly unfair, like what's been happening to the world, basically. And when people go and install grass, like, what they're actually doing isn't really unlocking something that hasn't already been used on their device. Like, other companies out there are already using your device to scrape the web. But by installing grass, you at least have a choice, and for a lot of folks, it's kind of like, why not make that choice? And to your point about people, leaving networks around the time their first airdrops happen. As far as grass is concerned, after the airdrop checker came out in the bonus epoch, there were actually 400,000 new users who are now participating in stage 2 of the network. So we've actually seen user growth as opposed to the opposite.
I do want to get more into just what grass does, but maybe final question airdrop wise that I'll often ask after a TGE is, if you could go back a year ago, would you do it again? Do you think that launching a token was worth it?
I think every crypto project has its fair share of community members, either being impatient or wanting one thing or another. One thing I can say about grass, though, is that I've been incredibly impressed with the community from day one, and I'm beyond grateful for them. I'd say, and obviously my opinion's a bit biased, but I think it's the best community in crypto. We have this Discord server right now of almost 500,000 people who are constantly speaking in many different languages. Sometimes I just pop in there and chat with some of them. And yeah, your question about, was launching the grass token a good decision for the foundation? I mean, grass wouldn't really exist without it. So I guess the only answer is yes. Because the whole point of the network is to distribute network ownership to users, and that wouldn't be possible without the grass token.
Grass has been talked about a bit because it was a really widely distributed airdrop that lots and lots of folks participated in, because, as you mentioned, you didn't even need to own any crypto to participate in it. But I think a lot of the folks that are receiving this airdrop maybe don't even have a deep understanding of what Grass is or does. So just why don't you give us a brief overview about what Grass is and does?
Basically, every large company in the world today needs the ability to read lots of data from the internet at a very regular cadence. So let's say you're a large retailer. You need to be able to read all of your competitors' websites in real time to know what their prices are. Because if you don't know those, if you don't know what your competitors are pricing things at, how do you price your own products? And the solution to this, most might assume is, okay, well, we can go and just set up this big computer in a data center, which can go and read all of those websites and download all the information. And then we'll just go and do our own data science or analytics or whatever is necessary in order to, make our decisions. And that used to be the case. That's how people used to do this. But over the last decade or so, and this practice is called web scraping. Like over the last decade or so, this practice became increasingly competitive. And all these companies that are reading each other's websites started saying, hey, I want the ability to read your website, but I don't want you reading mine. So they started blocking each other's IP addresses. So they would block IP addresses that belong to data centers or IP addresses that belong to commercial institutions. And then they would only allow...
And this is because there's functionally just really large web scraping companies that are out there, but it's known who they are and you can figure out which IP address to block these companies, right?
Yeah. Like a little known fact about the internet is that we actually ran out of IP addresses over a decade ago. Like when the internet was first designed, it was made with about 4 billion IPs, like 4 billion combinations of numbers that go into these IP addresses. And we ran out in the early 2010s. And the price of an IP address went from being free, right? Like if you were an ISP before, you go to the internet registry, they give you IP addresses for free. The price went from $0 to 1 cent. And all of a sudden, there was a secondary market for IP addresses, and they became increasingly scarce. Now, when there's a limited number of IPs, it's very easy to go and make a database and look at, okay, which IP does what? And all these ISPs have to go and register these things anyways. So if you're, this large retailer or if you're a big social media platform that wants to block, let's say, LLM developers from reading your information, what you can do is say, okay, if this IP address is a known data center or a known commercial entity, we just block it. But if it's a residential IP, because all the residential IP addresses in the world are marked in these databases, if they can say if it's residential, we will allow it to visit our website. And the way you'd imagine, okay, if every company is doing this, then it should become impossible for all these companies to continue scraping each other because they're all blocking one another. But that's actually far from the truth, or that's far from the case. Over the last decade or so, what all these major companies started doing, instead of just saying, okay, you know what, let's allow each other to continue scraping the web and continue allowing the web, the public web to actually be public without certain actors being blocked and others not. Instead of doing that, they went and started installing software into your VPN or your TV screensaver or your garage door opener or random things that you've downloaded. They start converting your software into web scraping agents. So what they can effectively do is use your smart TV, which is always on in the background, to go and read their competitor's website. And the competitor's website thinks it's a residential IP because it's your device on your network. Now, if you think about it, all these companies scraping the web, it does make the internet, or it does make markets more efficient in a sense, because if all the retailers are scraping each other's prices, you get the best price as a consumer. Or if all the LLMs are scraping all the data, you get the best performance from an LLM. But the problem is they're able to make these things so good because they're using your device to do it and they're not paying you for it. And that's just incredibly unfair. And the way they get away with it is by sneaking things into your terms and conditions of things that you download. When we started building this when we started working on Grass 2 years ago, it was a few weeks after FTX collapsed and a few weeks before ChatGPT came out and became mainstream. So a lot of people thought we were crazy to be working on something crypto related. And a lot of people thought any AI use case of what we're doing, it must be like 5 or 10 years out. And, like at the time, maybe 1% of the public web was valuable for scraping. So, this problem was probably affecting 1% of the internet. After ChatGPT came out and became mainstream, it turned everything on its head. Like, it became 100% of the internet suddenly becoming valuable. And with that shift from 1% to 100%, we saw a proportional shift in these companies abusing people's devices and trust in order to go and scrape more and more data from the internet. And effectively, that's the ethical problem that Grass is stepping in to solve.
Interesting. This is also why smart TVs are so cheap, right? I think I read this somewhere that the data side of them is why you can get a TV for like $200. It's because the data is so lucrative.
Yeah. I mean, in addition to the bandwidth and resources, I'm sure that's not where it ends. I'm sure there are other things they do with data.
I'm sure, but it's crazy because if you look at like an inflation chart of like literally everything, it all goes up over the past 20 years, and then TVs just took a nosedive in terms of cost, which is a weird stat that I love. But I wanted to get into that last point where you mentioned you launch right after FTX collapse, right before ChatGPT comes out, and after we get ChatGPT, these AI models start needing to scrape the entire internet. This has led to several lawsuits, these types of things. I'm just curious, like reading the vibes. When you and I spoke, Andre, back in December of 2023, Grass was really pitching itself as like for AI training. And now it looks to me, just from some of the public messaging, that it's more we're just building a web scraping network, and it's not as AI forward. I'm curious what led to that. Do you see yourself less as like predominantly B2B for AI companies, or what's kind of the thought there?
Well, I mean, Grass is still critical for AI. That's never changed. And not necessarily just AI training, but also at the inference layer. And I'm happy to elaborate that in a moment. The reality of the situation is that Grass is useful for any data application that you can possibly think of. And AI remains maybe 90% of the demand on the network anyways. So Grass is far from pivoted away from servicing AI. If anything, it's been doing a lot more of that since the last time that we spoke. But I think what's really important for us, as far as like a messaging perspective, is to let people know that, hey, it's not just for AI, but rather any data application. And AI is kind of a funny label, anyways. Like we called it machine learning a few years ago. Before that, I guess people called it data science for a minute. And it's it's kind of cyclical messaging, but at the end of the day, it's all just crunching a bunch of data and trying to make predictions, and that's always been the major use case for Grass.
The Sei network brought parallel execution to the EVM with their V2 update this past spring. Sub-second finality and massive throughput are now available to EVM developers everywhere on Sei's high-performance Layer 1. Incentives for users are coming to Sei this month from teams like DragonSwap. Start farming on Sei today by visiting dragonswap.app. That's dragonswap.app. Thanks again to Sei for sponsoring today's episode. Would you consider Grass to be a DePiN network in the way we think about those in crypto? The reason why I ask is a segue into when I think of DePiNs business-wise, I think one of the biggest struggles is it's very easy to create supply. It's much more difficult to create demand. And I think Grass sort of fits this, where if you tell people, hey, install a Chrome extension that'll use your spare internet bandwidth to scrape the web, you won't even notice that it's happening, and we'll reward you with a token. That's pretty easy to incentivize, as you saw with how widely distributed the Grass airdrop was. What I'd be curious about is the demand side, because if companies have a pretty good thing going on right now where they can sneak web scraping infrastructure into TVs and garage door openers, then Why potentially pay more to come to Grass for their web scraping data?
That's a great question. So, firstly, they don't pay more at Grass. The second thing I guess is worth mentioning is the fact that we've heard a lot of people say this. When we started working on this, everyone was saying, "Oh, supply side." Actually, at first they were saying Grass will never be able to bootstrap millions of nodes because I remember in the very early days when we started working on this, the major question was, okay, this network needs over 1 million participants to actually work. How do we get there? And the constant feedback was, it's impossible to get millions of people to go and download something like this, and you have to educate them first, and that's so difficult to do, and it's something that's been possible. And one of the really funny things we've noticed is that as far as supply and demand goes, there's not enough supply to service all the demand on the network. It's been kind of the opposite of what everyone sort of assumes when it comes to crypto projects that are solving real world problems. The main reason I think for that is the fact that and sorry, let me quickly back up. Like the network today, and just to give people an idea of perspective, it's doing over 100 terabytes of data per day. That's more than the amount of data that went into ChatGPT to train it from scratch. And Grass is scraping that on a daily basis. And it isn't even servicing anywhere near 100% of the demand that's incoming at the moment. In order to do that, the number of nodes have to grow on the network because at the moment it's fairly saturated. And the big thing with a lot of companies that are seeing Grass, for them, it's you mentioned they have a good thing going on at the moment. From their perspective, it's not actually the best thing. All these Web 2 companies, they don't necessarily want to be evil. It's just that the incentive structures haven't existed for them to do the right thing for such a long time. And for so many of them, when we speak to them, it's kind of this sense of relief of, oh my goodness, thankfully someone is finally doing this because we've wanted to do things the right way. The current solutions are just unsustainable. And this is probably the biggest problem that Grass solves is this it bridges this ethical gap that's existed in the industry for such a long time. But another problem that's actually kind of interesting that's emerged over the last few years, especially as ChatGPT became mainstream and LLMs began revolutionizing the way that people use the internet. It's been the fact that only 2 companies in the world can do an internet scale web crawl. And, you can kind of guess who those companies are. They've been able to build multi-trillion-dollar businesses on the back of that. And you can ask yourself, okay, well, why is that a problem? That only 2 companies can do this. The issue is that when all these AI models are all these AI models are being developed all over the place, and we're starting to see LLMs begin to converge in terms of performance. What ends up differentiating them when they all kind of become just as good as each other, just as scaled and just as optimized, what really sets one apart from the other one is how well it can access new information as it appears on the internet. And those 2 internet scale web crawls that currently exist, those are the only 2 ways of doing that right now. And those 2 companies are building their own AI models. So why would any AI developer want to have to rely on them to actually make their AI model useful? Because without real-time data, it's very difficult to find PMF for AI. It needs the ability to read new information as it appears, and it'll always appear on the internet. And what we realized over the last few years as this problem became further and further exacerbated was that this is a problem that Grass needs to solve. And at its current roughly 3 million nodes on the network, it isn't able to, just because there's so much data on the internet that needs to be crawled on a daily basis. But at 10 times the current size of the network, it'll be capable of doing an internet scale web crawl. And that's what we're really excited for. And what we're seeing the most excitement for from a demand perspective is actually the live context retrieval engine that we're building. So, we call it LCR. And what it effectively does is it gives any LLM the ability to integrate with the internet in real time. So if you built an AI model and you need it to have online access, you can go and plug into Grass's LCR engine instead of relying on those two other kind of SEO poisoned web crawls in order to do it.
Interesting. I wanted to tease apart one part of that, because you said you're crawling more than the amount of data that it took to train ChatGPT on a daily basis, and yet it's unable to fulfill all of the inbound demand, which strikes me as a really kind of crazy claim. So can you just piece me through where's all that inbound demand coming from, and how is it that you have this much data but it's not being met?
Yeah. So the primary source of demand for the network right now is in multimodal data, which takes up a lot more, I guess, bandwidth than both bandwidth and storage than like text data, which is what ChatGPT was trained on. So automatically the numbers get much, much bigger. Now, what I mean by multimodal data for those listening is you have, when you're looking at AI models, they can exist in multiple modalities, or in other words, like multiple form factors. So you can, what most people are used to is ChatGPT, where the modality is text. You can type and it gives you a response and you read the response. Other modalities would include things like audio, where you can like talk to the model and it responds with voice, or like a mixed modality where, you type something and then it returns an image. So multimodal models are models that kind of capture a bunch of these different modalities. And whereas we've started to see convergence in LLMs and language reasoning, but we haven't really seen, the real scaling effects start to kick in for a multimodal model. So in other words, people made these text-based models like really, really, really big, and then they got to big to a certain point where making them even bigger is kind of a diminishing return. You might as well just kind of take a step back and focus on optimizing them. Whereas, for multimodal models, people are still making them bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're getting better and better. So a lot of the demand, to your question, on the Grass network today is coming from multimodal. And of course, in the next couple of years, we do expect this to saturate to a certain point. And that's why, I mentioned LCR earlier. It's where we expect, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the vast majority of demand on the Grass network to be happening. Because, like I said earlier, when all the models are kind of the same performance-wise, what really sets one apart from the other is how well it accesses new information as it hits the internet.
We spoke a little bit about Grass potentially as a DePiN, and some of the struggles with creating demand. What about like the tokenomics long-term for Grass? As we mentioned, just carried out an airdrop. It was very successful in creating supply, and there were a lot of users, participating in Grass. But how are you kind of thinking about keeping people incentivized to keep running Grass in exchange for the token, and versus the trade-off they might make of this airdrop isn't worth it to me anymore, I'm just going to uninstall Grass?
Well, so first of all, tokenomics wise, and token wise in general, that's all handled by the Grass Foundation, and they have the DAO's best interests in every decision that they make. So I have a lot of confidence in whatever, in what they're doing with tokenomics, I suppose. As far as the actual utility of the token and how, it fits within the Grass network, a lot of people have been, like we talked about earlier, a lot of people have been looking at Grass as this thing where they're earning points. Those points will translate to rewards in the form of network ownership. And what we've been encouraging users to do is not miss the forest for the trees. So in other words, Airdrop 1 was this great incentive for joining the network early on before it even launches. What hasn't been turned on yet is bandwidth monetization. So when your network or your device is being used for live context retrieval, once it launches, every single LCR call that's happening by these large companies, it needs to be powered by the Grass token as gas on the network. And even though that company is paying in fiat, that needs to be converted to Grass on the network. That's the primary use case for the token. There's also stage 2 right now. And there are so many other things that are happening soon on the network. We've also been teasing a creator platform. And I can delve into that very slightly, but not too much, because that'll be, I guess, announced more officially in the near future. And we're also working on a hardware device, which is coming out in the next few months.
Andrej, I also want to ask you about this process where AI models could essentially gain access to what's going on the internet in a live way. Because this is really, if you use ChatGPT or some of these mass chatbots at the moment, that's kind of one of their issues, is they can't be fully up to date because they can't access the internet. So what's it like building that? And I'm just curious about hearing more about that whole project.
Yeah, happy to talk about that a bit more. So the way live context retrieval works fundamentally is by deploying a crawl of as much of the internet as possible on a regular basis. So let's say a daily basis. And when you do that, you're doing something called indexing. So you're kind of ranking and sorting all these pages and organizing them. And then once that's done, then we're building what's called a knowledge graph on top of all that information. And a knowledge graph is a set of relationships between facts. So you can say like OpenAI buys Rockset. So then like the relationship between OpenAI and Rockset is the fact that OpenAI bought that company, and so on and so forth. And you end up creating this huge web, and it looks like a graph. And that's why they call it a knowledge graph. So that, when you send it a question, you can actually go and break down the words in the question and find the most similar answer in that knowledge graph. And that knowledge graph kind of calculates a distance and finds your answer and then returns it to you. That's actually how, it's very similar to how traditional web search works. So when you go and search something on a traditional search engine, it's doing something very similar. Now, the difference is that traditional search engine has an extra layer on top, which we call the SEO data poisoning. So advertisers have completely skewed those results for many years. And that, when you look at it, always comes back down to the wrong incentive structures being in place. So traditional search is optimized for clicks, not for information. When you look up something on a search engine, the first few results aren't necessarily the answers to whatever you're asking the search engine, but they are the most likely things to get clicked by you as a human. If you think about what AI models need, however, they don't really want clickable content that's been, created by commoditizing your curiosity. They just want the right answer. So the key difference between LCR, like Grass's LCR, and what traditional web search is the fact that LCR is unbiased. And when it's live, it'll be the only unbiased way to connect an LLM to the internet in real time. AI models don't care about, what the best clickbait is. They care about knowledge. And that's what Grass is optimizing for.
I'm curious as well what you make of sort of the broader claim that is out there that the internet in the age of AI is essentially going to eat itself. Because if you're doing things like LCR, the AI bots are trained on content that's being created, but then there's no longer much incentive to create the content that the AI bots are being trained on, because everyone just turns to the AI rather than the Wall Street Journal. And all of this content goes away and AI is training itself on itself, and it's like an infinite doom loop and the internet goes away. Like what's your take on that broadly?
It's a fantastic question. One thing I've been saying a lot lately, and people might be getting tired of me saying it. It's the fact that I don't believe Web3 is crypto. Like, if the current iteration of the internet is Web2, The next iteration is very unlikely to be crypto itself. It's our belief that the next iteration of the internet is actually AI. So, by definition, Web3 is AI, not crypto. And the big reason for that is because the shift from Web 1 to Web 2 was towards a more closed internet. When the iPhone came out, when social media came out, there was this really fundamental paradigm shift that occurred where a lot more people started using the internet, but a lot more people using the internet ended up interacting with a lot less websites, which were being curated by an even smaller number of applications. The only way to access the internet previously, at least from a graphic user interface, was through a browser, and you type in a URL and go click on links and go exploring, and it's all open and whatever. Web 2 kind of brought in efficiency at the cost of openness, where you have a few apps that curate information to you, and the internet got more and more closed. There's no reason to believe that that trend has ended, where the internet's becoming even more closed. And to your point, AI is actually, in its current state, is actually promoting an even more closed internet. We're going to go from a small number of applications and a small number of websites to potentially one or two LLMs, which are our funnel to the rest of the internet and how we interact with them. And a lot of the major AI companies, if you look at some of the things they're producing, you can already tell the internet's moving in this direction. Now, what that tells us is that we're kind of on a clock. Like, we're running out of time to make sure that if AI becomes the dominant form or like the form factor of the internet, that it doesn't also make the internet more closed, the way new iterations of the internet have become. And the way to do that is by fixing the incentive structures. And the way to do that is with crypto. So I guess to our point, crypto is not Web3, but rather it can save Web3, if that makes any sense.
You've mentioned how with Web 1 into Web 2, we've inherited this just much less free internet, much more closed internet, I guess I should say. But we've also become accustomed to a world where many, many things are free. Like, we just expect to go on the internet and be able to do most things for free outside of like streaming services, I guess. But, ChatGPT is free, at least some models of it are. And so far, a lot of these AI initiatives burn a ton of cash in that they do generate a good amount of revenue, but they spend way more than they actually make. And this is a bit of a monetization issue that currently exists for AI. So I'm just curious, like, does crypto have benefits to monetizing AI, or what are the ways in which, like, crypto, which is just an inherently kind of financial thing, how do you see broadly crypto helping AI monetize?
I wouldn't really say crypto will ever be a tool for monetizing AI. However, where I think it'll play a very important role, especially as far as Grass is concerned, is making sure that the monetization that does happen from AI is going to the right places. And that's the real problem that crypto should be solving. And it would be a great injustice to the technology, like to all of blockchain, if this doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because when we were talking about live content retrieval on Grass, you mentioned like these chatbot models have all become really good, and they are not very differentiated in terms of what you can do with them. And so the next frontier of what makes them better is being able to live query the internet. But I'm just curious, like, do we get to a world where that's now a commodity, and then these things struggle to actually make money because everyone can do live content retrieval with AI? Is that like a downside risk, I guess, of all of this?
Well, I think it's a probable end state that a lot of models end up using Grass for live context retrieval because it will become table stakes, right? There'll be a point where anyone building an LLM that needs to access the internet in real time will need to use Grass because it will be, Grass's LCR will be the only unbiased way to do so And by not choosing it, by default, companies would be disadvantaging themselves.
To conclude, I want to ask a bit about your connections to Solana, because Grass is built on Solana. The token is issued there, but you've also mentioned you're building a rollup for data reasons. So I guess why build on Solana? What's that been like? And then secondly, why build a rollup?
One of the most important things for us, that we want to take into consideration when building Grass, is that none of the costs of operating on a blockchain get carried through to clients and customers. No one using Grass should, for context retrieval or for scraping or whatever, should feel the burden of operating on a blockchain, whether it's for high gas reasons or for latency reasons where it's really slow. So by default, Solana becomes the only option as sort of the base layer because it's fast and because the transactions are very cheap. So those are automatically things that you worry about less. Now, as mentioned earlier, a big chunk of Solana got taken down by the Grass airdrop 1, and that's only the first airdrop, and that was only people claiming the airdrops. It wasn't even proofs of scraping or anything else like that getting pushed to the blockchain. The end state, or what we really want to build towards, is a ledger where every single web transaction gets posted in real time. And the average web session has about 70 web requests. And if you multiply that by tens of millions of users that'll eventually be on the Grass network, there's not a single blockchain in the world that can actually operate and support all those things hitting the ledger at once. So the obvious thing to do is, or not obvious actually, it was actually an incredible architecture job done by our CTO, Chris, one of my other two co-founders. Huge shout out to him for designing this. But what he came up with was a way that we can actually roll up all these web requests and have all of that published on a separate ledger. And then bundles of those transactions or proofs of them get published to Solana L1. And that way you can kind of have the best of both worlds, where all the digital assets are being secured on the Solana L1, so the Grass token, for instance. But then all the verifications and all the proofs and the security and making sure that these web requests are being published properly and transparently happens on this rollup. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Folks like Toli and Mert will kind of talk about one of the big advantages of Solana being the ability to tap into this globally shared state where everything happens on the L1. There's a lot of critiques of Ethereum because L2s or rollups are kind of parasitic and move activity away from the base chain. So I don't know, how do you respond to some of the, critiques in the Solana world of rollups as a model to make blockchains faster or more scalable?
Yeah, I think when most people hear roll up or layer 2 or any of that kind of terminology, I think they're really used to the stuff that goes on in the Ethereum ecosystem. So in the Ethereum ecosystem, the big problem is the blockchain is just hard to use for anything. For literally, if you want to send your friend some stable coins, it's pretty expensive to do that. So what people have done is basically copied Ethereum and run that on an AWS server or whatever, and then send the summary bundles of just sending summaries to the chain and bundling all the transactions into individual ones. So all these rollups and layer 2s on Ethereum, most of them are just doing what Ethereum does in the first place and then sending things to Ethereum for whatever reason. So I guess I can see where people are coming from when they refer to those things as parasitic, because at the end of the day, if you think of Ethereum as a business, and then another company goes and copies their business model, takes all their customers, and then just sends them a cut, right? That's what's going on with L2s. So I can see why people would say that. But what I think that doesn't encompass is rollups that are built for very app specific use cases. So, for Grass in particular, like Grass isn't copying anything that Solana does. Like everything that Solana does, which is securing digital transactions and making sure that they, that they're sent efficiently and in parallel and like cheaply and quickly, like Solana still gets to do all of that. But verifying web requests and like, making sure that the right parties are sharing the right amount of bandwidth and stuff like that can all happen on the Grass rollup. And I think it would be very unfair to call something like that parasitic. Like, I don't think anyone in the world would say that.
You've just carried out your airdrop a few hours ago now.
The foundation.
What are you turning your attention to?
Right now, all of our attention is on stage 2 of the network, which is going to be a lot more exciting than stage 1. I mentioned earlier that hardware devices are coming out soon. A number of users on the Grass network, they want to become power users. They want to get more actively involved. And that's really exciting because there are certain aspects of building an internet scale web crawl that just can't be run entirely on user devices. You need more specialized types of hardware for that. And that's something that we're going to offer. So definitely stay tuned for that. And then I've also hinted pretty heavily at, creator platforms that I think that's going to make a big splash. So keep an eye out for that as well.
Great. Looking forward to the big splash. Well, that is all the time we have for today, though, sadly. Andre, thank you for coming on the show. It's been good getting to catch up and just hear about everything Grass is building. Best of luck in the future.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, Jack.
All right. Take care. This episode would not have been possible without the Sei network. Don't forget, user incentives are coming to Sei from teams like DragonSwap. Make sure to check out Sei today. You can start farming on Sei by visiting dragonswap.app.